In 1788, a Persian soldier named Mithridates made a mistake that would cost him 17 days of his life. Not 17 days in prison. 17 days of dying. He was placed between two boats fitted together like a shell. Only his head and limbs protruded. He was force-fed milk and honey until diarrhea erupted uncontrollably. Honey was poured over his exposed skin. The boats were pushed onto a stagnant pond. The flies came within hours. They laid eggs in every opening of his body. The eggs hatched into larvae. The larvae began feeding. Guards were assigned to keep Mithridates alive by force-feeding him more milk and honey every day. He lasted 17 days before his body finally surrendered to the creatures consuming him from the inside. This method was called scaphism. It is the first of 20 torture methods I will show you tonight. But here is what you need to understand. Scaphism is not even close to the worst on this list. The 20 methods you are about to learn span 4,000 years and 6 continents. Most have never appeared in any documentary. Some were classified by governments for decades. Others were recorded in trial transcripts that sat untranslated in archives until this century. You will learn about the 30 years war torture so vile that soldiers vomited while performing it. About the French Revolutionary, who drowned 4,000 people in a single month, tying naked couples together before throwing them in the river. About the American prison torture from 1966 that used electrical current in ways that made victims prefer death. You will learn about the Chinese execution method photographed in 1905, images so disturbing they were hidden from the public until the 1970s. About the Brazilian military technique that suspended victims in positions that destroyed their joints within hours. About the Iranian method that leaves no marks on the body but guarantees permanent psychological destruction. Every method is documented. Every victim I mention is real. Every detail comes from court records, survivor testimony, archaeological evidence, or eyewitness accounts. If you are drawn to history that reveals what human beings are truly capable of, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. What follows is worse than anything you have imagined. Let us begin where I started, with the method that took 17 days to kill one man. The Persians called it the boats. The Greeks called it scaphism, from their word for hollowed-out vessel. It was reserved for crimes against the royal family, and it was designed to make death take as long as biologically possible. Mithridates was a common soldier at the Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BC. During the fighting, he killed a man named Cyrus the Younger, who was leading a rebellion against King Artaxerxes II. This should have made Mithridates a hero. Instead, it killed him. The problem was that Artaxerxes wanted credit for killing Cyrus himself. He announced to the court that he had personally struck the fatal blow. The lie became official history. Weeks later, at a royal banquet, Mithridates got drunk and bragged about being the true killer of Cyrus. Multiple witnesses heard him. Word reached the king within hours. For contradicting the king's official version of events, Mithridates was sentenced to the boats. 2 boats of identical size were selected. One was placed right side up. Mithridates was forced to lie inside it on his back. The second boat was inverted and fitted over the first, creating a sealed shell with holes cut for the victim's head, hands, and feet. The force feeding began immediately. Milk mixed with honey poured down his throat in quantities designed to cause violent diarrhea. His own waste accumulated inside the sealed boats, unable to escape. More milk and honey was poured over his exposed face and extremities. In the Persian summer heat, flies arrived within the first day. They swarmed his honey-coated skin. They entered his mouth, his nostrils, his ears. They laid eggs in every available surface. The boats were pushed onto a stagnant pond and left floating. The water kept the temperature from becoming immediately lethal while providing no relief from the insects. Guards rode out daily to force-feed him more milk and honey. Their orders were explicit: keep the prisoner alive as long as possible. Death by starvation or dehydration would be considered failure. By the third day, the larvae had hatched. They were feeding on his living tissue while simultaneously breeding in the waste-filled interior of the boats. Mithridates was being consumed from the outside and the inside simultaneously. The Greek historian Plutarch documented what the guards observed over the following 2 weeks: the flesh rotting while the victim remained conscious, the creatures visibly moving beneath the skin, the smell so overwhelming that guards wrapped cloth around their faces before approaching. Mithridates remained conscious for most of the 17 days. He begged for death. The guards were forbidden to provide it. When he finally died, the boats were opened. What remained inside was no longer recognizable as human. The body had become an ecosystem, a colony of insects inhabiting what had once been a man. Scaphism was practiced until approximately the 4th century AD. No visual record survives. Only the written accounts of historians who understood that some things must be documented precisely because they are unbearable to contemplate. The Persians designed scaphism for maximum duration. 12 centuries later, German soldiers developed a method designed for maximum degradation. They made their victims drink until their stomachs burst. But what they were drinking was not water. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, killed approximately 8 million people across Central Europe. It was the deadliest conflict in European history until World War I, and it produced innovations in cruelty that soldiers themselves struggled to perform. The Schwedentrunk translates to Swedish drink. It was named after the Swedish mercenaries who popularized it, though German and imperial soldiers used it just as frequently. The method targeted civilians suspected of hiding valuables. Soldiers would occupy a village and demand that residents reveal where they had buried their money, their grain, their livestock. When residents claimed to have nothing, the Schwedentrunk began. The victim was restrained, and their mouth was forced open. A funnel was inserted into the throat. The soldiers then poured liquid manure into the funnel. Not water, not alcohol. The liquid collected from barn floors, the slurry of cow and pig waste mixed with urine and rotting straw. The pouring continued until the victim's stomach distended visibly. Then soldiers would stomp on the abdomen, forcing the contents back up, and begin pouring again. Contemporary accounts describe victims being forced to consume between 3 and 5 gallons of the slurry. The stomach would stretch beyond its capacity. Internal ruptures were common. Those who did not die from stomach rupture died from the infections that followed. The psychological effect on the victim's family was the method's purpose. Soldiers performed the Schwedentrunk on one family member while others watched. After witnessing what had been done to a husband, a wife would typically reveal any hidden valuables immediately. The practice was documented extensively in village records, church accounts, and letters from survivors. A pastor named Johann Daniel Mink described witnessing the Schwedentrunk performed on 17 villagers in a single day in 1634. 14 of them died within hours. 3 survived with permanent internal damage. The method was so common during the war that it developed regional variations. In some areas, boiling liquid was used instead of barn slurry. In others, the liquid was mixed with sand or small stones to cause additional internal damage. Swedish military commanders officially prohibited the Schwedentrunk in 1636 after complaints from Allied German princes that the practice was depopulating entire regions. The prohibition was largely ignored by soldiers who had discovered the method's effectiveness. The 30 Years' War eventually ended. The trauma did not. Villages across Germany passed down stories of the Schwedentrunk for generations. The phrase entered German idiom as a term for any forced consumption of something vile. The Swedish drink killed individuals. The French Revolution developed a method that could kill thousands in days. A single official drowned 4,000 people in 1 month. He called his invention Republican marriages. Jean-Baptiste Carrier arrived in Nantes in October 1793 with orders to crush the counter-revolutionary uprising in the Vendée. He found the city's prisons overflowing with captured rebels, Catholic priests, and suspected royalists. The guillotine could execute perhaps 30 people per day. Carrier had thousands of prisoners and weeks of pressure from Paris to show results. He invented what he called noyades, meaning drownings. The process was industrialized slaughter. Flat-bottomed boats called gabarres were modified with trapdoors in their hulls. Prisoners were loaded onto the boats, packed tightly, chained to prevent swimming. The boats were towed to the center of the Loire River. The trapdoors opened. Everyone drowned. The first noyade occurred on November 16, 1793. 90 Catholic priests were drowned at once. Their crime was refusing to swear loyalty to the revolutionary government. Carrier then refined his method. He began ordering male and female prisoners, stripped naked and tied together in pairs before drowning. He called these marriages republicans, Republican marriages. The pairing was deliberately obscene. Elderly priests tied face to face with young prostitutes, nuns bound to convicted thieves, teenage boys tied to elderly women. The purpose was not merely death, but humiliation. Carrier wanted the drownings to be discussed throughout France. He wanted people to understand what happened to enemies of the revolution. Between November 1793 and February 1794, Carrier drowned an estimated 4,000 people. Some historians estimate the number was closer to 6,000. Records were not carefully kept. The bodies clogged the Loire. They washed up on riverbanks for 20 miles downstream. Fishermen reported catching corpses in their nets for months. The water supply became contaminated. A public health crisis developed. Carrier ordered bodies weighted with stones, but the sheer volume overwhelmed any disposal system. He then ordered firing squads to supplement the drownings, mass executions in quarries outside the city. The quarries were used because the sound was partially contained. When the political tide in Paris shifted in early 1794, Carrier was recalled and arrested. His trial transcript runs to hundreds of pages. Witnesses describe the drownings in detail. Survivors who had escaped by swimming or grabbing debris testified about what they had seen. Carrier's defense was that he had been following orders and acting in the Republic's interest. He argued that extraordinary times required extraordinary measures. The Revolutionary Tribunal disagreed. Carrier was guillotined in December 1794. His death took 3 seconds. His victims had taken considerably longer, struggling in the cold river water, bound to strangers, dying in the darkness of the Loire. France killed by water. China developed a method that killed by sequential mutilation over months. It had 5 stages. Each stage was designed to leave the victim alive for the next. The Wu Xing, or 5 pains, was codified in Chinese law during the Qin dynasty around 220 BC. It remained in various forms until the early 20th century. The method was reserved for treason, rebellion, and crimes against the imperial family. The 5 pains were administered in a specific sequence: tattooing, amputation of the nose, amputation of 1 or both feet, castration or confinement, and finally, death. Each stage was separated by a recovery period. The purpose was not rapid execution, but extended degradation. The victim would live with each mutilation, experiencing its consequences before the next was applied. Stage 1 was mo, tattooing. The character for criminal was permanently inscribed on the forehead using ink and needles. The victim would carry this mark for however long they survived, visible to everyone they encountered. Stage 2 was Yi, amputation of the nose. This was performed with a knife or chisel. Noses do not regenerate. The victim's face was permanently disfigured, a walking advertisement of their crime. Stage 3 was Yu, amputation of one or both feet. Some versions amputated at the ankle, others removed only the toes. The result was the same. The victim could no longer walk normally, could no longer work, could no longer escape. Stage 4 was Gong for men, castration. For women, the equivalent was Jin, confinement in a crushing box that caused internal injuries. Male victims who survived castration often became palace servants. Female victims rarely survived Jin. Stage 5 was Da Pi, death by cutting the body into pieces. The historian Sima Qian, author of the foundational records of the Grand Historian, was sentenced to castration in 99 BC for defending a general who had surrendered to the enemy. He chose castration over death so he could complete his historical work. He spent the rest of his life as a court eunuch, documenting the dynasty that had mutilated him. Records from the Han Dynasty described the 5 pains being administered over periods ranging from weeks to months. The victim was kept alive between stages through medical care. Guards were assigned to prevent suicide. The suffering was carefully calibrated. Later, dynasties modified the 5 pains. Some added additional stages. Others combined stages for more severe crimes. But the principle remained constant. Death was the final punishment, preceded by a systematic destruction of the body's integrity. The 5 pains distributed suffering over time. The Chinese developed another method that concentrated suffering into a single, terrible session. It was photographed in 1905. The images were so disturbing they were classified for decades. The Western name is Death by 1,000 Cuts. The actual number was considerably higher, and photographic evidence exists of exactly what it looked like. Ling Qi was practiced from approximately 900 AD until its abolition in 1905. The method was standardized in legal codes that specified the sequence of cuts, the tools to be used, and the expected duration. The victim was tied to a wooden frame in a public location. The executioner began with flesh from non-vital areas: chest, arms, legs, back. Each cut removed a small piece, perhaps the size of a coin. The cuts were made with sharp knives to minimize tearing. Opium was sometimes administered, not for mercy, but for duration. The punishment's purpose was extended suffering witnessed by crowds. A victim who lost consciousness too early was considered a failure. The standard 3,000 cut version progressed systematically toward vital areas. The sequence was specified. Start with the breasts, move to the thighs, then the arms, then the shoulders. The face was typically reserved for later stages. The killing blow, usually to the heart or throat, came only after the specified number of cuts. In April 1905, a man named Fu Zhuli was executed by Ling Qi in Beijing for murdering a Mongolian prince. French soldiers stationed nearby photographed the execution. The photographs were smuggled out of China and eventually published in European academic journals in the 1970s. The images show Fu Zhuli tied to the frame. His torso is covered with wounds arranged in disturbingly regular patterns. His face appears calm in some photographs, contorted in others. The executioner is visible in several frames, working methodically, his basket of removed flesh beside him. The photographs show the crowd as well, hundreds of spectators, watching with expressions ranging from fascination to apparent boredom. Children are visible in some frames. Food vendors operated at the edge of the crowd. Fu Zhuli's execution lasted approximately 15 minutes. shorter than many Ling Chi executions because of pressure from foreign observers. Contemporary accounts describe executions lasting 3 hours or more when performed at the traditional pace. Ling Chi was abolished in April 1905 as part of legal reforms during the late Qing dynasty. Fu Juli was among the last victims. The photographs of his death remain the only visual documentation of a practice that killed thousands over nearly a millennium. The Chinese made death visible. The Iranians developed a method that leaves no visible mark at all. It is still used today. Survivors describe it as worse than any physical torture. White torture has no single inventor. It emerged in the 20th century as governments sought interrogation methods that produced no evidence, left no scars, and could be denied if exposed. The Iranian government refined it to a precise science in the prisons of the Islamic Republic. Survivors who have escaped describe a system designed to destroy the mind while leaving the body intact. The prisoner is placed in a white cell. The walls are white. The floor is white. The ceiling is white. The lights, which remain on 24 hours a day, are white. The prisoner wears white clothing. Food, when provided, is white rice on a white plate. Guards wear padded shoes that make no sound. They do not speak. If the prisoner speaks, they do not respond. The door has no handle on the inside. There is no window. There is no clock. There is no way to measure time. The sensory environment never changes. There is no dark and light cycle. There is no variation in temperature. There is no sound except what the prisoner makes, and the prisoner quickly learns that speaking to no one produces a particular kind of madness. Duration varies. Some prisoners report being held in white conditions for weeks. Others report months. The impossibility of tracking time is part of the torture. A week can feel like a month. A month can feel like a year. The psychological effects begin within days. Hallucinations, both visual and auditory. Profound disorientation. Panic attacks, triggered by the unchanging environment. Difficulty distinguishing between sleep and waking. Difficulty remembering who they are. Survivors who have been released and debriefed by human rights organizations describe the experience as annihilation of the self. They describe forgetting their own names, forgetting their families, forgetting what they had been accused of. They describe wanting to die but having no means to accomplish it. The white room leaves no bruises. Medical examinations find nothing wrong, but survivors frequently suffer permanent psychological damage. Many cannot function in normal society after extended white torture. Some report ongoing hallucinations years after release. Some take their own lives. White torture is currently practiced in Iranian prisons. It has been documented by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and numerous international bodies. Iranian authorities deny its existence. The denial is part of the design. A torture that leaves no evidence is a torture that can continue indefinitely. The Iranians torture the mind. The ancient Romans tortured everything, including the victim's symbolic relationship to the natural world. They sewed the condemned into a leather sack with 4 specific animals. Each animal was chosen for a reason. The punishment was called poina kule, the penalty of the sack. It was reserved for parricide, the murder of a parent or close relative. Roman law considered parricide so unnatural that the murderer had to be isolated from all elements: earth, water, air, and fire. The condemned was first beaten with blood-red rods, a ritual marking them as cursed. They were then sewn into a leather sack with 4 animals: a dog, a snake, a rooster, and a monkey. Each animal was symbolically chosen. The dog represented shamelessness, because dogs were considered animals without shame, and the parricide had acted without shame. The snake represented venom, the poison of betrayal. The rooster was included because roosters crow at dawn, a symbol of natural order that the parasite had violated. The monkey represented the perversion of human nature into something bestial. The sack was then thrown into the sea or a river. The condemned could not touch the earth because they had violated its fundamental relationships. They could not be burned because that would release their spirit into the air. They had to drown among creatures as unnatural as themselves. Inside the sealed sack, the practical effect was chaos. 4 terrified animals trapped in darkness with a human. The animals would bite, claw, and attack anything they encountered. The victim would try to protect themselves while drowning. Death came from some combination of animal attack and suffocation. Emperor Hadrian modified the punishment in the 2nd century AD. He allowed substitution of locally available animals in provinces where monkeys were rare. The dog and snake remained mandatory. Regional variations used different birds or mammals for the other 2. The jurist Modestinus recorded that parricide was the only crime in Roman law for which the punishment was considered worse than simple death. The state did not merely execute parricides. It symbolically removed them from the natural order entirely. Historical records document numerous poena culae executions throughout Roman history. The Emperor Claudius allegedly sentenced more parricides to the sack than all previous emperors combined during his 14-year reign. The practice continued in modified form in medieval Germany, where murderers of close relatives were sometimes sewn into sacks with cats and dogs before drowning. The Romans isolated their condemned. The Chinese perfected a method of public humiliation that lasted not minutes but months. The victim wore their torture. They could never escape it. They could not eat without help, and everyone they encountered knew exactly what they had done. The cangui was a portable pillory, a large wooden board fitted around the neck with holes for the head and hands. Unlike European pillories, which were stationary, the cangui was worn continuously. The prisoner carried it everywhere, for as long as the sentence specified. The dimensions were standardized by crime. Minor offenses warranted a cangui weighing perhaps 20 pounds. Serious crimes earned cangus weighing 60 pounds or more. The largest documented kangs weighed over 100 pounds. The board extended past the shoulders in every direction. The prisoner could not reach their own face. They could not feed themselves. They could not use the toilet without assistance. They could not lie down to sleep because the board would not fit through any door. Prisoners wearing kangs depended entirely on the mercy of strangers. Some family members would follow their condemned relatives, providing food and water. Others were abandoned entirely. Those without help died of dehydration within days. The cangu's duration varied by sentence. Minor offenses might require only days. The most serious crimes could mandate months. One recorded case from the Qing dynasty describes a prisoner wearing a kang for 3 years before death finally ended the sentence. The prisoner's crimes were written on the board in large characters, visible to everyone who passed. The cangui was not merely physical punishment, but public advertisement. The prisoner became a walking announcement of their transgression, unable to escape public knowledge wherever they went. European visitors to China in the 18th and 19th centuries documented the cangu extensively. They described seeing prisoners collapsed in streets, unable to move, waiting for death. They described the smell of prisoners who had been wearing kangs for weeks, unable to clean themselves. They described the flies that gathered around condemned faces that could not be brushed away. The cangui was abolished in 1905 as part of the same legal reforms that ended Ling Qi. Photographs from the late Qing period survive showing prisoners wearing kangs of various sizes, their faces resigned to a punishment that might last longer than they could endure. China tortured publicly. In 1966, an American prison developed a torture so secret that it took decades for the truth to emerge. It used electrical current. It was performed on American citizens, and the people who created it kept meticulous records. The Tucker State Prison Farm in Arkansas operated for decades as effectively a private fiefdom. The warden had absolute power. The state provided minimal oversight. What happened inside those walls was known only to those who experienced it. In 1966, an investigator named Tom Merton was appointed superintendent. What he discovered led to one of the most significant prison reform cases in American history. The Tucker telephone was a device constructed from an old-fashioned crank telephone. The generator that had once powered the phone's ringer was repurposed. Wires extended from the generator to 2 points, one attached to the prisoner's genitals, one attached to their ear or toe. When the crank was turned, electrical current passed through the prisoner's body. The device was not an improvised creation. It had been refined over years. Guards understood precisely how fast to crank for maximum pain without causing death. They understood how long a session could last. They understood which prisoners could endure more current, and which required gentler treatment. The Tucker telephone was used routinely for discipline, for interrogation, and apparently sometimes for entertainment. Prisoners who violated rules were called to the telephone. The phrase became understood throughout the Arkansas prison system. Sessions lasted from seconds to hours. The current caused muscles to contract uncontrollably. It caused burns at the attachment points. It caused victims to lose control of bodily functions. Prolonged sessions caused heart irregularities. Some prisoners died. When Merton exposed conditions at Tucker Prison, the resulting legal case, Holt v. Sarver, reached the Supreme Court in 1970. The court ruled that conditions in Arkansas prisons constituted cruel and unusual punishment, establishing that prisoners retained constitutional rights even while incarcerated. The Tucker telephone was dismantled. The guards who had used it were never prosecuted. The device itself no longer exists, destroyed when the prison was reformed. But the testimony from prisoners who experienced it fills court documents. They described the anticipation being as terrible as the pain itself. They described fellow prisoners who had been subjected to the telephone and were never the same afterward. The Tucker telephone was American-made. In South America, military dictatorships developed their own electrical methods and added physical contortion that made pain inescapable. The parrot's perch left victims permanently disabled. Many wished it had simply killed them. The name means parrot's perch in Portuguese. The device is simple, a horizontal bar positioned approximately 2 feet off the ground. The victim is bound with their wrists tied to their ankles, the bar passed behind their bent knees. They hang from the bar like a parrot perched on a branch. Brazilian military intelligence perfected the method during the dictatorship that lasted from 1964 to 1985. It was used on suspected leftists, labor organizers, students, journalists, and anyone else deemed threatening to the regime. The physical effects begin immediately. The position compresses the chest, making breathing difficult. Blood pools in the head, causing pressure and pain. The joints of the knees, hips, and shoulders are stressed beyond their normal range. Within an hour, the pain becomes overwhelming. Within several hours, lasting damage begins. The joints start to separate. The pressure in the head can cause bleeding. Victims frequently lose consciousness from the combination of pain and restricted breathing. But unconsciousness was not permitted. Guards would revive victims and continue the session. The po de arara was typically combined with other methods: electrical shocks, beatings, waterboarding. The victim's helpless position made them completely vulnerable. After the end of the dictatorship, Brazil established a truth commission that documented military torture methods. Thousands of survivors testified about the parrot's perch. Their accounts fill multiple volumes. Many survivors suffered permanent damage, shoulders that never healed properly, chronic pain in the knees and hips. Some were never able to walk normally again. The method was designed to break bodies, as well as wills. The Truth Commission documented at least 400 cases of the parrot's perch, but acknowledged that the actual number was likely much higher. Many victims died during torture and were never counted. Others refused to testify, too traumatized to revisit the experience. The Brazilian military officers who used the parrot's perch were protected by an amnesty law, passed in 1979. Most were never held accountable. Many continued careers in the security services after democratization. Brazil tortured with position and electricity. Dutch sailors discovered that the ocean itself could be a torture device. They called it keel hauling. The barnacles did the rest. The word comes from the Dutch keel halen, meaning to drag along the keel. The practice was used by Dutch, English, and French navies from the 16th through 19th centuries. The procedure appears simple. The victim is tied to a rope that runs beneath the ship from one side to the other, passing under the keel. He is thrown overboard and dragged underwater to the other side. What makes keel hauling horrific is what covers a ship's bottom after months at sea: barnacles. These small crustaceans attach themselves to wooden hulls in colonies inches thick. Their shells are sharp as razors. A man dragged across a barnacle-encrusted hull does not emerge intact. The shells cut through clothing, then skin, then flesh. A short-distance keel hauling, lasting perhaps 30 seconds, produces deep lacerations across the entire body. A long-distance keel hauling, from bow to stern rather than side to side, produces something closer to flaying. Dutch naval records document keel-hauling sentences throughout the 17th century. The Admiralty established specific rules: keel-hauling for striking an officer, keel-hauling for theft above a certain value, keel-hauling for mutinous speech. The duration was determined by the severity of the offense. A quick drag might last 30 seconds and be survivable. A slow drag might last 2 minutes or more, drowning the victim before the barnacles finished their work. Survivors described the experience in court testimony: the cold shock of the water, the disorientation of being submerged, the sensation of their skin tearing as they scraped along the hull, the uncertainty of whether they would be raised before their lungs gave out. A Dutch physician named Job Beyster documented the injuries of keel-hauling survivors in 1734. He described wounds covering 70% of the body surface. He described victims who survived the keel hauling but died within days from infection. He described the psychological effects on victims who knew their ship would be at sea for months, with the same barnacle-encrusted hull that had nearly killed them. The Royal Navy abolished keel hauling in 1853. The practice continued informally on merchant vessels for decades. The last documented keel hauling occurred in the 1880s on a whaling ship in the Pacific. Barnacles tore flesh randomly. Medieval European executioners developed tools designed to tear flesh precisely. The crocodile shears were heated until they glowed. Then they were applied to the part of the body that had committed the crime. The device was designed specifically for regicide, the murder or attempted murder of a king. It was shaped like a pair of pliers with the head of a crocodile, the jaws lined with teeth that would grip flesh and refuse to release. The shears were heated over a fire until the metal glowed. Then they were applied to the body part deemed responsible for the crime. For attempted assassins, the shears targeted the hands that had held the weapon. For those who had conspired but not personally attacked, the shears might target the tongue that had spoken treason or the ears that had heard plots. The heating served two purposes. The hot metal cauterized as it cut, preventing the victim from bleeding to death before the punishment was complete, and the burning added another dimension of pain to the tearing. The crocodile shears were used throughout medieval and early modern Europe. They appear in execution records from France, Germany, and the Italian states. Museum specimens survive in several European collections. A German execution record from 1472 describes the use of heated shears on a man named Hans, who had attempted to poison the Duke of Bavaria. The executioner began with the fingers, removing them joint by joint with the heated jaws. He proceeded to the hands at the wrists. The execution lasted approximately 2 hours before Hans was finally killed by decapitation. The shears were not always lethal. Some victims survived, permanently mutilated, released to live with the evidence of their crime, literally torn from their bodies. The psychological effect on witnesses was part of the purpose. The shears were used publicly, the screaming, and the smell of burning flesh demonstrating to assembled crowds what happened to those who raised their hands against royalty. The crocodile shears tore the guilty. A different method was reserved for those who refused to declare their guilt at all. Giles Corey was 81 years old. He was pressed with stones for 2 days. His last words became legend. The device consisted of 3 components: a metal cap placed on top of the victim's head, a bar positioned under the chin, and a screw mechanism connecting them. When the screw was turned, the cap pressed downward while the bar pressed upward. The compression was gradual. The interrogator could turn the screw fractionally, wait for the victim to answer questions, turn it again. The session might last hours, with the pressure increasing incrementally throughout. The first effect was on the jaw. The upward pressure of the bar forced the lower jaw into the upper teeth. Teeth shattered. The jaw might dislocate or break. Blood flowed from the mouth. The second effect was on the eye sockets. As compression increased, the pressure sought release. The eyes, contained only by soft tissue, would eventually extrude from their sockets. The metal cap featured holes positioned precisely for this purpose. The third effect was on the skull itself. Continued compression would crack the bone. Brain damage was inevitable at this stage. Most victims either died or confessed before reaching this point. The Spanish Inquisition documented the head crusher in procedural manuals. It was classified as a method of preparatory torture, used to encourage confession before more severe methods were applied. The implication that the head crusher was considered mild tells you something about the Inquisition's standards. Original devices survive in museums in Toledo, Amsterdam, and Vienna. The screw mechanisms are still functional. The metal shows wear patterns from repeated use. The effectiveness of the head crusher lay in its gradualism. Victims could feel exactly what was happening to them. They knew that one more turn of the screw would produce one more increment of destruction. The anticipation was as useful for interrogation as the pain itself. The Inquisition crushed vertically. Japanese forces during World War II discovered that nature could apply pressure with similar patience. They positioned prisoners over growing bamboo. What happened next took days. Giles Corey stood accused of witchcraft in Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692. He was 81 years old. His wife Martha had already been condemned. He knew he would be convicted. The court demanded that he enter a plea, guilty or not guilty. Corey refused to answer. Under English common law, which governed the colonies, a trial could not proceed without a plea. The solution was pene forte e dure, literally, strong and harsh punishment. The accused would be pressed with heavy weights until they entered a plea or died. Corey knew this when he refused to speak. He also knew that under the law of the time, a person who died without conviction could not have their property confiscated. By refusing to plead, he ensured his estate would pass to his children rather than the government that was trying to kill him. The pressing occurred on September 19th, 1692. Corey was stripped naked and placed on the ground in a field. A wooden board was placed on his chest. Stones were added one at a time. Sheriff George Corwin asked for his plea. Corey said nothing. More stones. His ribs began to crack. The sheriff asked again. Corey's response was recorded by multiple witnesses. More weight. The pressing continued through the day. By evening, Approximately 400 pounds of stone sat on the board. Corey's chest had collapsed. He could barely breathe. He had spoken only twice since the pressing began, both times to say the same thing. More weight. He died on the second day, still refusing to plead. His tongue, forced out by the pressure, was reportedly pushed back into his mouth by the sheriff using his cane. Corey achieved his objective. Because he was never convicted, his property passed to his sons-in-law, rather than the government. His death by pressing remains the only such death in American history. His widow Martha was hanged 3 days later. Pressing killed through gravity's patient accumulation. The Inquisition developed a device that concentrated pressure into a much smaller area. It crushed skulls so slowly that victims could feel their own faces changing shape. Bamboo is the fastest growing plant on Earth. Some species grow more than 35 inches in a single day. The shoots emerge from the ground pointed and rigid, capable of penetrating soil, rock, and organic matter. During World War II, Japanese forces reportedly used bamboo's growth as an instrument of torture. The victim was restrained in a horizontal position over a patch of young bamboo shoots, with the shoots positioned to pierce their body as they grew. POW testimony from camps in Burma, the Philippines, and China describes witnessing this method. Victims were restrained for days as the shoots slowly penetrated their bodies. The growth was continuous, approximately an inch per hour. Escape was impossible. Relief was impossible. Death came from internal bleeding, organ damage, or infection. The duration depended on the positioning of the shoots. A shoot aimed at the abdomen might take 2 days to cause fatal damage. A shoot aimed at the chest might take less. After the war, skeptics questioned whether bamboo could actually penetrate human tissue. In 2008, the television show Mythbusters tested the method using a ballistic gel dummy. Over 72 hours, they documented bamboo shoots completely penetrating the gel. The bamboo did not merely push against resistance, it grew through it. The growth pressure of bamboo has been measured at approximately 900 pounds per square inch. Human tissue cannot resist this pressure over time. Given hours, bamboo can penetrate concrete. Flesh offers considerably less resistance. The exact prevalence of bamboo torture during World War II remains debated. Some historians argue it was widespread in certain camps. Others suggest it was rare, used primarily for psychological terror. POW accounts are consistent enough to confirm that it occurred, inconsistent enough to prevent reliable estimates of frequency. What is not debated is the physical possibility. Nature, given time, can perform penetrations that no human-made device could accomplish. Bamboo killed through growth. Medieval European justice killed through exposure, hanging victims in cages and leaving nature to finish the job. Some lasted weeks. The birds came for them regardless. The gibbet was a metal cage designed to fit tightly around the human body. It was not an execution device. It was a display device. The execution happened slowly, publicly, through exposure to the elements and whatever chose to feed on the victim. After sentencing, the condemned was placed alive into the cage. The cage was then hung from a gallows, a tree, or a special pole at a public location. The victim remained suspended until dead. Death came from various causes. Dehydration, usually within 3 to 4 days in summer, longer in cooler weather. Exposure to cold, rain, or sun. Infection from wounds caused by the tight metal pressing against skin, or the birds. Crows and ravens learned that gibbeted prisoners were reliable food sources. They would perch on the cage and feed on any accessible flesh, beginning with the eyes, which were soft and easily reached through the cage bars, continuing to the face, the ears, the fingers. Victims who survived multiple days frequently arrived at death eyeless and partially consumed while still alive. The birds did not wait for death. They merely waited for stillness. English law specified gibbeting for certain crimes through the 18th century. Piracy, smuggling, and murder of superiors were common causes. The gibbeted bodies served as warnings, left hanging until they decomposed and fell apart. An English court record from 1732 describes a pirate named John Richardson, who was gibbeted at Portsmouth. Witnesses recorded that he lived for 8 days in the cage. The first birds arrived on day 2. By day 5, he had no eyes. He was still alive. He was still screaming. The gibbet was abolished in England in 1834. The abolition was not for humanitarian reasons, but practical ones. Decomposing bodies created health hazards, and the smell disturbed nearby property owners. The gibbet left death to nature. Indian rulers trained animals to accelerate the process. The elephants of the Mughal Empire could crush a skull or a single limb on command. The choice depended on the emperor's mood. Throughout South and Southeast Asia for over 2,000 years, trained elephants served as instruments of capital punishment. The practice was documented by Greek, Roman, Persian, and European travelers who witnessed executions firsthand. The elephants were specifically trained for execution. They understood commands to kill quickly or slowly, to target the head or the limbs, to crush or to tear. The variation was the point. The ruler could demonstrate mercy through quick death or displeasure through extended suffering. A Portuguese traveler named Duarte Barbosa observed elephant executions in 16th century India. He described elephants that would crush a man's legs first, then his arms, then his torso, then finally his head, the sequence taking several minutes. He described other elephants trained to toss victims into the air and catch them on tusks. He described elephants that would simply place one foot on a victim's head and press slowly. The elephants were valuable animals, carefully maintained by the state. Their willingness to kill on command was developed through extensive training. Handlers used positive reinforcement, treats, and praise for correct execution technique. European visitors found the practice both horrifying and fascinating. Multiple travelers noted that the elephants seemed to understand the gravity of what they were doing, that they approached executions with what appeared to be reluctance until commanded, then performed efficiently and without apparent emotion. The Mughal Emperor Akbar used elephant execution throughout his reign in the 16th century. Court records document hundreds of executions, with varying methods specified according to the crime and the emperor's judgment of appropriate severity. The practice continued into the 19th century. The last documented elephant execution occurred in the 1860s in Baroda, India. British colonial authorities suppressed the practice as they consolidated control over the subcontinent. The elephants were then used for other purposes. Their training for execution was allowed to lapse. Within a generation, the knowledge of how to train an elephant to kill on command had largely disappeared. Elephants killed with mass. The Chinese developed a method that killed with a single, precise cut. The waist chop severed the body in half. The victim often remained conscious long enough to know what had happened. The Chinese called it Yao Zan, the waist chop. It was exactly what the name describes: execution by cutting the body in half at the waist. The method was used from the Zhou dynasty through the Qing, a span of over 2,000 years. It was reserved for the most serious crimes: treason, rebellion, and particularly heinous murders. The execution was performed with a large blade, similar to a guillotine but operated horizontally rather than vertically. The victim was restrained with their midsection exposed. The blade was positioned at the waist. With a single stroke, the body was severed. The horror of the waist chop was that it did not immediately kill. The cut was made below the heart and lungs. These organs continued functioning for some period after severance. The brain, still receiving blood, remained conscious. How long victims survived varied. Some accounts describe seconds, others describe minutes. One possibly apocryphal account claims a victim wrote 7 characters in his own blood after being severed, completing a final message before dying. A Qing dynasty official named Fang Xiaoru was sentenced to waist chop in 1402 for refusing to write the proclamation legitimizing a usurper's reign. When told he would be executed along with his entire extended family, he reportedly said, "Execute all 10 degrees of my kinship, I do not care." The emperor took him literally. Over 800 people were executed along with Fang. The waist chop was considered so severe that it was formally abolished in the 18th century during the Qing dynasty. The emperor Yongzheng ended the practice after reportedly witnessing an execution and being disturbed by how long the victim survived after severance. The abolition was notable because the Qing retained other execution methods that were also extremely painful. The waist chop was distinguished by the specific horror of its mechanism, the victim's consciousness during their own bisection. The waist chop killed with a blade. The Chinese also developed a method that killed with a cage, forcing victims to strangle themselves through exhaustion. They called it standing in the cage. Standing was all you were permitted to do. When you could no longer stand, you died. The standing cage was a wooden frame approximately 7 feet tall with a platform for the victim to stand on and a collar that locked around their neck. The collar was positioned so that the victim could only breathe while standing at full height on their toes. The mechanism was simple. Stand and you breathe. Lower your heels and the collar tightens. Fall asleep, lose your balance, or simply become too exhausted to stand and you strangle yourself. The execution was public. The cage was placed in a prominent location where crowds could watch. The victims' struggle to remain upright, their gradual weakening, their eventual collapse, all occurred in full view. Duration varied by the victim's physical condition. Strong, healthy individuals might last 2 or 3 days, managing brief periods of partial rest by timing when they relaxed their legs. Weaker individuals might last hours. The cage was used throughout Chinese history, but became particularly common during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Photographs from the late Qing period survive showing victims in standing cages, their faces contorted with the effort of maintaining the position that kept them alive. European missionaries documented the standing cage in considerable detail. A French priest named Évariste Huc observed an execution in the 1840s and described the victim's progressive deterioration. The trembling legs, the increasingly desperate attempts to maintain height, the final collapse when muscles simply refused to respond. The standing cage combined physical torture with psychological torment. Victims knew exactly how they would die. They experienced their own strength failing. They understood that every moment of life required active effort, and that the moment effort became impossible, death would follow. The cage was abolished alongside other traditional punishments in 1905. Like many abolished methods, it continued in informal use for years afterward, in remote areas beyond central government control. The standing cage killed through exhaustion. The final method on this list, killed through temperature, using molten metal applied drop by agonizing drop. It was called the lead sprinkler. The name does not begin to describe what it did. The device resembled a small pitcher or watering can with a perforated top. Inside, the executioner placed lead, tin, or other metals that could be melted over a fire. When the metal liquefied, the sprinkler was tilted over the victim's body. Drops of molten metal fell through the perforations onto the skin. Each drop burned through the flesh instantly. The metal's temperature, over 600 degrees Fahrenheit, caused immediate tissue destruction, but the drops were small. Each one created a wound perhaps the size of a coin. Dozens, hundreds of drops were required for death. The executioner controlled the pace, Slow drops stretched the agony. Faster application hastened death. The perforations in the sprinkler allowed precise control over the flow. The target areas varied by crime. Thieves might receive drops on their hands, perjurers on their tongues, general criminals across their entire bodies. The symbolism of targeting specific body parts was combined with the practical horror of burning through layer after layer of flesh. Historical records from medieval Germany, France, and Italy document the lead sprinkler's use. It appears in execution inventories alongside other torture implements. Museum specimens survive in collections across Europe. A German execution protocol from 1523 describes the use of molten lead on a counterfeiter named Hermann. The executioner began with the hands that had produced false coins, progressing to the arms, then the torso. The execution lasted approximately 90 minutes. The lead sprinkler was particularly feared because of the unpredictability of the pain. Drops fell where they would. The victim never knew which part of their body would burn next. The anticipation, watching the glowing metal approach, not knowing where the next drop would land, was itself a form of torture. Like many medieval methods, the lead sprinkler fell out of formal use during the 18th century as execution methods were standardized and, in theory, made more humane. The last documented use was in the late 1700s. The metal eventually cooled. The body eventually failed. The crowd eventually dispersed. But the records remained. You have now learned 20 methods that span 4,000 years of human history. From Persian boats to Brazilian perches. From Chinese cages to European sprinklers. From methods that took 17 days to methods that killed with a single stroke. Every method was documented. Every victim I mentioned was real. Every detail comes from court records, survivor testimony, archaeological evidence, or eyewitness accounts. These methods were not performed by monsters. They were performed by soldiers following orders, by executioners doing their jobs, by governments maintaining control, by crowds seeking entertainment. They were performed by ordinary people who had convinced themselves that what they were doing was necessary, or just, or divinely sanctioned. The lesson is not that humans are uniquely cruel. Other animals kill. Other animals cause pain. The lesson is that humans are uniquely creative in causing pain. We invent methods. We refine them. We document them. We pass them down through generations, improving efficiency, extending duration, maximizing suffering. We build boats designed to keep victims alive for 17 days while being consumed by insects. We train elephants to crush limbs on command. We photograph 1,000-cut executions and file the images for future reference. We are the only species that writes procedural manuals for torture. Most of these methods are no longer used. Legal reforms, international pressure, and changing standards have eliminated many from formal practice, but some continue in prisons and detention facilities around the world. White torture is practiced today. Electrical torture is practiced today. Position torture is practiced today. The creativity that produced scaphism and the lead sprinkler has not disappeared. It has merely adapted.